So we've seen that the climate changes naturally over time, and in some cases unnaturally. But why does the climate change? And so when it comes to natural factors, one thing, or probably the most important thing to consider, is something called Milankovitch cycles. And these are changes to Earth's orbit, and these are happening they overlap with each other. So it's like, why do we have ice ages? Why do we have, warm periods and cold periods, going back thousands of years before humans have been emitting carbon dioxide? A lot of it has to do with these natural cycles of the Earth's orbit. Some of it has to do with the shape of the Earth's orbit. And this is like 100,000 year pattern. The tilt of the Earth, we talked about being 23.5 degrees. Over about 41,000 years, that tilt varies. So sometimes we have less tilt. Remember, if there's less tilt, less seasonality, and then sometimes we have more tilt, more seasonality. Sometimes the orientation of the Earth in space changes over about 20-something thousand years. And so we have these overlapping patterns. We have precession, which is kind of the 28,000 year cycle going on. We have the changes in the orbit of the Earth. We have the changes to the tilt of the Earth. And then those combined change the amount of sunlight that's coming in at higher latitudes, like where normally is the colder part of the Earth. And so we kind of look at all of these together, and we look at how that affects the incoming amount of solar energy. Then we overlay that on top of stages of glaciation. You can see that these are generally related to each other. It's not completely understood, but you can kind of see a pattern here where change to Earth's orbit affects things like glaciation. So these are called Milankovitch cycles. Now there's other things that over different time scales will affect the climate of the Earth as well. Continental drift over millions of years. We're going to be talking about that in the future. That at different times over the past hundreds of millions of years, the continents have been in different configurations. And that increases the amount of, because of land-water contrast, that can affect the climate of the Earth. Those can also impact ocean currents. So for example, 10 million years ago, the North America and South America were disconnected and water could flow freely between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. But as change to the continents closed up the gap, that changed the pattern of ocean currents that we have today. Impact events can play a role. These are kind of random events such as an asteroid or a comet hitting the Earth. And what happens is when they do, they blow a lot of debris into the upper atmosphere. These are considered largely responsible for the extinction of much of life on Earth, like the dinosaurs, because of an impact event around 65 million years ago. On smaller time scales, we have changes because of volcanic activity. These push material into the upper atmosphere, block sunlight, and cause a drop in temperature, generally over a period of years. So here's an example of in the 1800s, you had I think it's Krakatoa, it's a volcano that spread ash along that blew up, and material got on the trade winds and was distributed over a large part of the Earth. And so prior to that, you had a relatively warm period, relatively warmer period of time, and you have the volcano explode. In year one, temperatures drop, and then as it takes it maybe a couple of years to spread, year two is even worse, and then as that material begins to dissipate, things start to warm back up, so they get back to about where they were before. Volcanoes can play a role as well. And note that when you watch the video where they look at, where they model changes in the climate, you can see where they include volcanoes. You see dips in the temperature because of volcanic events. And then also another type of change to the atmosphere is the greenhouse effect. So greenhouse gases, the emitting of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, is another cause of climate change. And this is where humans come into play here because of the greenhouse effect.